My son sold my $4 million ranch without telling me. Then he handed me a $15,000 check and said, "Go live far away from here." I just laughed. He had no idea what I had done a few days earlier, but let me start from the beginning. Because this story isn't just about betrayal. It's about what happens when someone underestimates a woman who's spent 67 years learning how to survive. My name is Patricia Thompson, and for 50 years, I called the Rolling Hills Ranch in Montana my home. 4,000 acres of pristine grassland, a main house that could fit 3 families, and enough cattle to make any rancher proud. My late husband Robert and I built this place from nothing but a dream and 2 strong backs. When he passed 5 years ago, I thought I'd spend my remaining years watching sunsets from our wraparound porch, maybe teaching my grandchildren how to ride horses the way I taught their father. I should have known something was wrong when my son Michael started asking different questions during his visits. "Mom, do you ever think about downsizing?" he'd say, stirring his coffee with that nervous energy I remembered from his teenage years. "This place is so big for just one person." At first, I thought it was sweet concern. Michael had always been my gentle boy, the one who cried when we had to put down old cattle and who insisted on naming every barn cat we ever had. He was 38 now, working some corporate job in Denver with his wife Jessica and their 2 kids, Emma and David. They'd drive up every few weeks, the children racing through the house like tiny tornadoes, while the adults sat around my kitchen table talking about work and school and normal family things. But lately, those conversations had shifted. Jessica would glance around the living room with calculating eyes, commenting on how expensive it must be to heat such a large space. Michael would bring up stories about elderly people who'd been taken advantage of by contractors or who'd had accidents living alone in remote areas. "We just worry about you, Mom," Jessica would say, her voice dripping with what I now realize was practiced concern. "What if something happened? We're 2 hours away." I'd brush off their worries with the same response every time. "I've been taking care of this land longer than you've been alive, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere." The thing about family dynamics is that they shift so slowly, you don't notice until you're already drowning. For months, I attributed their questions to love. They cared about their aging mother and grandmother. They wanted to make sure I was safe and happy. It seemed natural that they'd be concerned about me living alone on such a vast property. What I didn't see were the private conversations happening during their visits, the hushed discussions on the front porch after they thought I'd gone to bed, the way Michael would excuse himself to take phone calls, walking out toward the barn where he thought his voice wouldn't carry. If I'd been paying closer attention, I might have noticed how Jessica's eyes lingered on the antique furniture, the original artwork Robert and I had collected over the decades, the Persian rugs that had been wedding gifts from my grandmother. I might have caught the way Michael asked specific questions about property taxes, maintenance costs, and the current market value of ranch land in our area. But I was grieving, still adjusting to life without Robert, and I wanted to believe that my son's increased attention meant he was finally ready to step into his role as the man of the family. I was lonely, and their visits filled the silence that had settled over the ranch like dust on old furniture. The first real red flag came during Emma's 12th birthday party, which we held at the ranch in late spring. The whole family was there. Michael, Jessica, the kids, even Jessica's parents had driven down from Billings. We'd set up tables in the backyard, and I'd spent 2 days cooking all of Emma's favorite foods. I was in the kitchen, frosting her birthday cake, when I overheard Jessica talking to her mother near the open window. "The property taxes alone are probably $15,000 a year," Jessica was saying, "and she's got that old oil furnace that probably costs a fortune to run. Michael says she's too stubborn to see reason." "What does he want to do?" Jessica's mother asked. "Well, we can't force her to move, but maybe, if we frame it as a health and safety issue, emphasize how isolated she is, how much work the place requires. She might start to see that she's being selfish, holding on to all this when she could downsize and help us with Emma and David's college funds. My hand stilled on the frosting spatula. Selfish. They thought I was being selfish for wanting to live in the home I'd built with my husband, on the land where I'd buried 3 dogs, 2 cats, and more cattle than I could count. Selfish for wanting to leave something meaningful to my grandchildren instead of liquidating my life's work to pay for their education. But the words that really cut deep were too stubborn to see reason. As if my desire to remain in my own home was some kind of character flaw that needed to be managed. I finished frosting that cake with shaking hands, plastered on a smile, and sang happy birthday to my granddaughter while my heart broke a little. That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat on my porch and really looked at my situation for the first time since Robert's death. I was 67 years old, in good health, mentally sharp, and financially comfortable. The ranch was paid off. My retirement savings were solid, and I had enough passive income from various investments to maintain my lifestyle indefinitely. I wasn't a burden on anyone. I wasn't asking for help. I was simply an older woman who wanted to live peacefully on her own property, but apparently that wasn't convenient for my son and daughter-in-law. Over the following months, their visits became more frequent, but the tone shifted dramatically. Instead of family dinners and grandchildren's laughter filling the house, every conversation seemed to circle back to my situation. Michael would bring articles about seniors who'd been scammed or injured on their property. Jessica would mention retirement communities with wonderful activities and medical care right on site. They started using phrases like peace of mind and quality of life, but what they really meant was that my independence was inconvenient for them. They wanted me settled somewhere predictable, somewhere they could check a box and say they'd handled their parental responsibility. The most heartbreaking part was watching my relationship with Emma and David change. These children who used to race into my arms now seemed coached in their interactions with me. Emma would ask careful questions about whether I was lonely or scared living by myself. David would talk about how cool it would be if Grandma lived closer to them in town. I realized that Michael and Jessica were using my own grandchildren as emotional leverage, teaching them to see their grandmother not as a strong, independent woman, but as a fragile old lady who needed to be managed for her own good. That's when I started to understand that this wasn't about love or concern. This was about control and probably money, though I couldn't yet see the full scope of what they were planning. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in September. I had a routine doctor's appointment in town, just my annual physical with Dr. Martinez, who'd been taking care of me for 15 years. The appointment went perfectly. Blood pressure good, cholesterol levels fine, cognitive function sharp as ever. Dr. Martinez even commented that I was in better shape than most people 20 years younger. I was feeling proud and vindicated as I drove back toward the ranch. All those conversations about my declining health and safety concerns were clearly unfounded. I was doing just fine on my own, thank you very much. But when I turned down the long gravel driveway that led to my house, I saw Michael's silver SUV parked in my usual spot. That was odd. He hadn't mentioned planning a visit, and it was a weekday. He should have been at work in Denver. As I got closer to the house, I saw another vehicle I didn't recognize, a black sedan with county plates. My stomach dropped. County vehicles usually meant officials of some kind, and unannounced official visits were rarely good news. I parked behind Michael's SUV and walked toward the front porch, my heart beating faster with each step. Through the living room window, I could see Michael sitting at my dining room table with a man in a suit, papers spread between them. They were both writing, heads bent over documents like they were signing something important. The front door was unlocked, my own front door to my own house, and I walked in without knocking because this was still my home, despite whatever was happening at my dining room table. "Michael!" I called out. "What's going on here?" Both men looked up, and the expression on my son's face wasn't surprise or embarrassment. It was irritation, like I was interrupting something important. The stranger, a thin man with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, smiled at me with the practiced warmth of someone who delivered bad news for a living. Mrs. Thompson, the man said, standing and extending his hand. I'm Robert Klein from Klein & Associates Real Estate. Your son has just completed the sale of your property to Pinnacle Development Corporation. Congratulations. This is quite a substantial transaction. The world tilted sideways. Sale of my property? I looked at Michael, waiting for him to explain that there had been some kind of mistake, that this man was confused, that whatever was happening wasn't what it appeared to be. Instead, Michael avoided my eyes and said, Mom, we need to talk. We certainly do, I said, my voice somehow steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. Mr. Klein, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I haven't sold my property to anyone. The real estate agent looked confused, glancing between Michael and me. But the power of attorney, he shuffled through his papers. Mr. Thompson provided all the necessary documentation. The sale has been finalized. Power of attorney. Those words hit me like a physical blow. I had never signed a power of attorney giving Michael control over my property. I had never even discussed such a thing with him. Michael, I said, and my voice was different now, colder. What have you done? He finally looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something I'd never seen before, not guilt or shame, but defiance, like he was angry at me for coming home and disrupting his plans. I did what needed to be done, he said. You weren't going to listen to reason, so I had to take care of things myself. This place is too much for you, Mom. You're going to hurt yourself out here, and then it'll be my responsibility to clean up the mess. I stared at my son, this man I had raised, loved, sacrificed for, and I didn't recognize him. The gentle boy who'd cried over dead barn cats had grown into someone who could sell his mother's home out from under her and justify it as an act of love. The sale price was $4.2 million, Mr. Klein said, apparently trying to lighten the mood. After fees and commissions, the net proceeds are just over $4 million. Quite a windfall for your family. $4 million. 50 years of my life, reduced to a number on a contract that I'd never signed. Where are the papers I supposedly signed? I asked, my voice getting steadier as my shock transformed into something much more dangerous. Michael and Mr. Klein exchanged a look. They're being processed through the county clerk's office, Michael said. Standard procedure. Which meant I couldn't examine them right now. How convenient. Mr. Klein, I said, turning to the real estate agent, I'm going to need copies of every document in this transaction, and I'll need the contact information for Pinnacle Development Corporation. Of course, he said, though he looked uncomfortable now. I'll have my assistant email everything to you by end of business today. After Mr. Klein left, Michael and I stood in my living room, soon to be my former living room, and looked at each other across a chasm that had opened up in the space of 30 minutes. How long have you been planning this? I asked. Mom, you have to understand. How long, Michael? He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he'd been caught lying about homework or broken windows. A few months, maybe 6 months. 6 months. While I'd been grieving his father, adjusting to widowhood, trying to figure out how to manage this big property alone, my son had been scheming to take it away from me. And Jessica knows? Of course she knows. We're married, Mom. We make decisions together. Just not with me, apparently, even though it's my property. Was your property, he corrected, and the coldness in his voice made my blood freeze. And you were never going to make the smart choice on your own. You're too emotionally attached to this place. Emotionally attached. Like loving the home you built with your husband was some kind of weakness. That's when he pulled out his checkbook and wrote me a check for $15,000, tearing it off and holding it out like he was doing me a favor. This should be enough to get you set up somewhere, he said. Jessica found a really nice assisted living place about an hour from our house. You'd have your own apartment, meal service, activities. You'd be much happier there. I looked at that check, $15,000 out of $4 million, and something inside me snapped. Not into anger, exactly, but into a clarity I hadn't felt since Robert died. You think $15,000 is my fair share of a $4 million sale? Mom, it's not about the money. It's about what's best for everyone. You'll be safer, we'll have peace of mind, and the kids will have their college funds secured. There it was, the real truth, finally out in the open. This wasn't about my safety or happiness. This was about Michael and Jessica wanting access to my assets, and my inconvenient desire to actually live in my own home was standing in their way. I took the check, not because I intended to cash it, but because I wanted evidence of how little my son valued me. You know what, Michael? I said, and I smiled. Really smiled. For the first time in months. You're absolutely right. I should go live somewhere else. The relief on his face was almost comical. He'd expected a fight, tears, arguments about family loyalty and legal challenges. Instead, I was agreeing with him. I'm so glad you understand, Mom. I know this seems harsh, but in a few months, you'll see that this was the best thing for everyone. Oh, I'm sure I will, I said. I'm sure I'll learn all sorts of interesting things in the next few months. Yeah, he hugged me goodbye, actually hugged me, like he'd just done me a tremendous favor, and promised to help me find a place to live, somewhere nice and safe. After he left, I sat alone in my living room and looked around at 50 years of memories that apparently meant nothing to my son. The photographs on the mantel, the furniture Robert and I had saved up to buy piece by piece, the view out the window that had been my first sight every morning for 5 decades. But instead of crying, I found myself laughing. Michael had made one crucial mistake in his little scheme. He'd assumed that being old meant being helpless, and that being a mother meant being endlessly forgiving. He was about to learn how wrong he was on both counts. That night, I called my lawyer. Patricia, David Chen said, his voice concerned. It's been a while. How are you holding up? David had handled Robert's estate, and before that, he'd been our family lawyer for 20 years. He knew me, knew my family, and most importantly, knew that I'd never signed any power of attorney. David, I need you to do something for me, and I need it done quickly and quietly. What's going on? I told him everything. The months of pressure, the mysterious sale, the forged documents. I could hear him taking notes, his breathing getting heavier as I described what Michael had done. Patricia, if what you're telling me is accurate, this is fraud. Serious fraud. We're talking about potential criminal charges. I know, I said, but before we go down that road, I need you to help me with something else. What do you need? I need you to research Pinnacle Development Corporation. I want to know everything about them. Who owns them? What they're planning to do with my land? How quickly they can close this deal? Okay. What else? I smiled, even though he couldn't see me. And then I need you to help me buy some property, somewhere my son will never think to look for me. Patricia, what are you planning? I'm going to disappear for a while, David. And while I'm gone, I'm going to make sure that my son learns exactly what it feels like to lose everything he thought he could count on. The investigation took 3 days. David called me back on Friday morning with news that made my blood boil and my plans crystallize at the same time. Pinnacle Development is owned by a shell company, which is owned by another shell company, but I tracked it down. The ultimate owner is a casino resort corporation. They're planning to tear down your house, clear your land, and build a massive gambling complex with a hotel and entertainment venue. A casino. Michael had sold the family ranch, the land where his father was buried, where he'd learned to ride horses and drive tractors and become a man, to a casino developer. There's more, David continued. The sale price you mentioned, $4.2 million, the actual price was $4.8 million. Someone pocketed $600,000 that should have gone to you." I wasn't surprised. If Michael was willing to forge legal documents and steal his mother's home, skimming money from the sale was probably the least of his crimes. "What about the timeline?" I asked. "The good news is that this was rushed. Pinnacle wants to break ground before winter, so they fast-tracked everything. The bad news is that means the sale will be final in 2 weeks, unless someone challenges it legally." 2 weeks? Michael thought he'd given himself a nice cushion, probably figuring it would take me months to understand what had happened, let alone do anything about it. He'd underestimated me again. "David, here's what I need you to do." Over the next 72 hours, David and I worked like a team of investigators building a case against a serial killer. Because in a way, that's exactly what we were doing. Michael had killed the mother he used to know and replaced her with a convenient victim he could manipulate and discard. But what we discovered during those 3 days went so far beyond what I'd imagined that I actually had to sit down and catch my breath when David laid out the full scope of my son's deception. "Patricia, you need to prepare yourself for this," David said during our meeting on Monday morning. His office was scattered with printouts, legal documents, and computer screens showing bank records that made my head spin. "What Michael did to you isn't his first rodeo. This is a pattern." He slid a thick folder across his desk toward me. "I hired a forensic accountant and a private investigator. What they found, well, let's just say your son has been living a double life for the past 2 years. I opened the folder and stared at bank statements, credit reports, and transaction records that told a story I couldn't have imagined in my worst nightmares. Michael Thompson, my gentle boy who used to cry over injured animals, had accumulated gambling debts totaling over $300,000, not just from the casino he'd mentioned to his wife, but from online poker sites, sports betting platforms, and private high-stakes games in Denver and Las Vegas. "This explains the rush to sell your property," David continued. "He owes money to some very serious people, Patricia. The kind of people who don't just send threatening letters when you're late on payments." But the gambling was just the beginning. The deeper we dug, the more horrifying the picture became. Michael had been forging my signature for over 8 months, not just on the power of attorney for the ranch sale, but on loan applications, credit card accounts, and even insurance policies. He'd taken out a home equity loan against his own house using falsified income statements, claiming he earned twice what his actual salary was. "How is this possible?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "How did no one catch this?" "He's been very clever about it," the private investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah Martinez, explained. "He used your maiden name on some documents, your married name on others. He opened P.O. boxes in 3 different towns to receive statements and correspondence. And he's been intercepting your mail selectively. Anything that looked financial or legal would disappear before you ever saw it." That explained so much. The missing bank statements I'd attributed to postal service problems. The credit card offers that suddenly stopped coming. The insurance notices that never arrived. "Sarah," I said, "what about Jessica? How much does she know?" Sarah and David exchanged a look that told me I wasn't going to like this answer. "Mrs. Thompson, Jessica filed for divorce 3 weeks ago." My world tilted again. "What?" "She found out about the gambling debts when a man came to their house looking for Michael. According to the police report, yes, there's a police report. This man threatened Jessica and the children if Michael didn't pay what he owed." I thought about Emma and David, my grandchildren, being threatened by loan sharks because of their father's addiction. The rage that filled me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. "Jessica knows about the ranch sale," Sarah continued, "but she thinks it's legitimate. Michael told her you'd finally agreed to sell and move into assisted living. She's been going along with it because she's terrified of what will happen to her children if Michael can't pay his debts. So Jessica wasn't the calculating villain I'd imagined. She was another victim, trying to protect her children from her husband's self-destruction. The conversations I'd overheard, the comments about expenses and maintenance, Those weren't schemes to steal my property. They were a desperate woman trying to convince herself that her husband's solution wasn't completely insane. "There's more," David said gently. "Michael didn't just forge documents to sell your ranch. He's been using your identity to secure loans and credit cards for months. You currently have 7 credit card accounts in your name that you never opened, totaling over $60,000 in debt. 7 credit cards, $60,000. My son had been systematically destroying my credit and financial reputation while planning to steal my home. How much of the ranch sale money is left?" I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. According to our investigation, Michael received approximately $4.6 million after fees and commissions. Of that, $2.8 million went directly to pay gambling debts and loan sharks. Another $800,000 was used to pay off credit cards and loans he'd taken out in both his name and yours. He put $400,000 into what he thought was a safe investment account, but that turned out to be another gambling platform disguised as a trading company. I did the math in my head. So out of my $4.6 million, he has about $600,000 left, maybe less depending on how much he's lost since Friday. $600,000. From a property worth nearly $5 million, my son had managed to preserve roughly 12% while destroying everything else through his addiction and criminal behavior. But here's what Michael didn't know. I hadn't been sitting idle all weekend, crying into my coffee and feeling sorry for myself. I'd been shopping. "David," I said, pulling out my own folder of documents, "I need to show you what I did on Saturday." His eyebrows went up as I spread my papers across his desk. Purchase agreements, bank transfers, and property deeds that represented the most satisfying 72 hours of my life. "Patricia, what is this? Remember when you asked what I was planning?" I smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. "I bought Michael's house." The silence in the room was deafening. "You what?" Sarah asked. "Michael's house is in foreclosure. Has been for 6 weeks, actually, though he probably hasn't told Jessica yet. The bank was looking for a cash buyer who could close quickly." I tapped the deed with my finger. "I am now the legal owner of the property where my son, daughter-in-law, and grandchildren live." David stared at me like I'd just announced I was joining the circus. "How did you even know it was in foreclosure?" "Because I called the mortgage company on Saturday morning and asked. Turns out that when you're behind on payments for 4 months and you've been lying on loan applications, banks get very nervous. They were thrilled to have someone offer to buy the loan and take the property off their hands. I'd used the money from my retirement accounts, money Michael didn't know about, money that wasn't tied to the ranch or any of the assets he'd been tracking. Robert and I had been careful about diversifying our investments, and those private accounts had just saved my family. But that's not all," I continued, pulling out another set of documents. "I also bought Jessica's parents' house." This time, David actually dropped his pen. They're retiring and moving to Florida anyway. When I called and explained the situation, well, let's just say they weren't exactly surprised to hear that their son-in-law was a gambling addict who'd been lying to their daughter. They were happy to sell to me privately and avoid the stress of putting it on the market. Sarah was shaking her head in amazement. "Mrs. Thompson, in 3 days I've managed to become my son's landlord and my daughter-in-law's benefactor," I finished. "Michael thinks he's made me homeless. He has no idea that I now control whether he has a place to live." But I wasn't done yet. "There's one more thing," I said, pulling out the last document in my folder. "I've retained the law firm of Morrison, Klein, and Associates to represent Jessica in her divorce proceedings. Pro bono." David's mouth fell open. "You're paying for Jessica's divorce lawyer?" "Michael destroyed her life just as much as he destroyed mine. The difference is she's got 2 small children to protect. I'm making sure she has the best legal representation available, and I'm making sure she knows about every asset Michael tried to hide, every debt he accumulated, and every lie he told." The beauty of my plan was starting to dawn on all of us. Michael thought he'd isolated me, made me dependent on his charity. Instead, I'd position myself to control every aspect of his life while remaining completely invisible. "When is the ranch sale supposed to be finalized?" I asked. "Thursday," David replied. 4 days from now." "Perfect. That gives us just enough time to prepare the surprise." I'd decided that Michael needed to experience exactly what he'd put me through. The shock of losing everything he thought was secure, the humiliation of being treated like a burden, and the terror of realizing that the people he'd trusted most had been working against him all along. But unlike what he'd done to me, my revenge would be completely legal. Wednesday evening, I called Michael and asked him to come to the ranch for dinner. "One last family meal before I moved out," I told him. I wanted to say goodbye to the place properly, and I hoped he'd bring Jessica and the kids so we could all have closure together. He was so relieved that I was handling this well that he actually sounded cheerful on the phone. "I'm proud of you, Mom. I know this wasn't easy, but you're doing the right thing." They arrived at 6 o'clock on Thursday, just as the sun was starting to set over the mountains. Emma and David ran through the house like they always did, checking to see if anything had changed since their last visit. Jessica hugged me carefully, like she was afraid I might break. Michael looked around the living room with satisfaction, probably calculating how much the furniture would be worth at auction. I'd set the dining room table with my best china, the set Robert and I had received as a wedding gift 50 years ago. Candles, cloth napkins, the works. If this was going to be my last dinner in this house, I wanted it to be memorable. "This is beautiful, Patricia," Jessica said, and I could hear the guilt in her voice. She was a good woman caught in an impossible situation, and I felt sorry for her. "Thank you, dear. I thought we should do this properly." We made small talk during the salad course. Emma told me about her school play. David showed me a drawing he'd made of a dinosaur, and Michael regaled us with stories from his office that I'm sure were more interesting to him than they were to anyone else. It wasn't until we were halfway through the main course that I decided it was time. "Michael," I said, setting down my fork and looking directly at my son, "I need to ask you something." "Sure, Mom. What's on your mind?" "When you forged my signature on the power of attorney documents, did you really think I wouldn't find out?" The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Emma and David kept eating, not understanding that the adult conversation had just taken a sharp turn into dangerous territory. Jessica froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. Michael's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, denial, anger, and finally, a kind of cold calculation that made my blood run cold. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. I reached under my chair and pulled out a manila folder that I'd placed there before they arrived. "These are copies of every document you signed with my name: the power of attorney, the sales agreement, the loan applications, the credit card accounts, all of them." I spread the papers across the table like I was dealing cards. "This is a forensic handwriting analysis showing that my signature appears in 7 different variations across these documents. None of them match my actual signature." Michael's face had gone white, but he wasn't backing down. "You're confused, Mom. You signed those papers. Maybe you don't remember, but I also have bank records showing that you've been transferring money out of accounts that were opened in my name without my knowledge, and loan documents showing that you used my Social Security number and credit history to secure financing that you had no intention of repaying." Jessica was staring at her husband like she'd never seen him before. "Michael, what is she talking about?" "She's having memory issues," Michael said, but his voice was shaking now. "This is exactly why she needs professional care. She's not thinking clearly." That's when I played my ace. "I also have surveillance footage." The color drained completely from Michael's face. "You see, when you've lived on a ranch for 50 years, you learn to be careful about security. We've had cameras on this property for the past 5 years, motion activated, high definition, uploading directly to a cloud storage service that Robert set up before he died. Zoe? I pulled out my phone and queued up a video file. This is from last Tuesday when you brought Mr. Klein here to finalize the sale. Would you like to see the part where you practice my signature on 3 different documents before he arrives? Michael stood up so fast he knocked over his water glass. You can't use that. It's entrapment or something. It's my property, Michael. I can record whatever I want on my property. And what I recorded was my son committing multiple felonies. Jessica was crying now, not the quiet tears of someone who was sad, but the harsh, ugly sobs of someone whose world was collapsing in real time. "How much?" she whispered. "How much money is gone?" I looked at her with as much compassion as I could manage. "Almost all of it, sweetheart. The gambling debts, the loans, the bad investments. Out of the $4.6 million from the sale, there's maybe $600,000 left." Emma and David had stopped eating and were looking around the table with the wide-eyed confusion of children who know something terrible is happening but don't understand what. "Grandma," Emma said in a small voice, "are you and Daddy fighting?" Before I could answer, Michael slammed his hand on the table, hard enough to make the dishes jump. "This is insane," he shouted. "You're my mother. I was trying to help you. I was trying to protect you from making stupid decisions with money you can't afford to lose." "Like gambling it away?" I asked quietly. "That's different. Those were investments that didn't work out. I was trying to multiply your money, make sure you'd have enough for long-term care." The lies came so easily to him. I wondered how long he'd been practicing them, how long he'd been telling himself that stealing his mother's life savings was actually an act of love. "Michael," I said, standing up and walking around the table to where he was standing, "I need you to listen to me very carefully." He looked down at me, and for a moment I saw a flash of the scared little boy who used to come running to me when he'd broken something or gotten in trouble at school. "You sold my house," I said. "You stole my money. You destroyed my credit. You forged legal documents and committed fraud. But worst of all, you looked me in the eye for months and let me believe that you loved me while you were planning to throw me away like garbage." "Mom, I do love you." "No," I interrupted. "You love what I could give you. There's a difference." I walked back to my chair and sat down, folding my hands in my lap like we were discussing the weather. "So here's what's going to happen. Tomorrow morning, you're going to walk into the sheriff's office and confess to everything you've done. You're going to return every penny you can recover, and you're going to sign papers giving Jessica full custody of Emma and David." "Are you out of your mind?" Michael's voice cracked. "I'm not confessing to anything, and I'm sure as hell not giving up my kids." "Oh, but you are," I said, and I smiled at him. "Because if you don't, I'm going to have you arrested for elder abuse, fraud, forgery, and identity theft. I'm going to make sure every detail of what you've done gets reported in the local newspaper. I'm going to ensure that everyone in this county knows exactly what kind of man you really are." I paused to let that sink in. "But more importantly, I'm going to evict you from your house." Michael blinked. "What?" "I bought your house, Michael, on Saturday morning. I am now your landlord, and as of right now, your lease is terminated." The silence in the room was deafening. Jessica's tears had stopped, and she was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You bought our house?" she whispered. "I bought your house, your parents' house, and I've retained the best divorce lawyer in the state to represent you, pro bono." I turned to Michael, who looked like he was about to be sick. "You wanted me to go live somewhere far away from here. Well, guess what? You're the one who's going to be looking for a new place to live. Jessica and the children can stay in the house as long as they need to. You, on the other hand, have 24 hours to pack your things and get out." Michael's face went through anger, denial, bargaining, and finally landed on a kind of desperate fury. "You can't do this. Those kids are my children. That's my wife. You can't just You can't destroy my family." "I'm not destroying your family, son. You already did that. I'm just making sure the people you hurt have a safe place to land while they figure out how to rebuild their lives." I stood up and walked to the front door, opening it wide. "Now get out of my house." 6 months later, I was sitting on my front porch. Yes, my front porch, in my house on my land, watching Emma and David play with the new horse I'd bought them. The legal challenges to the ranch sale had been successful. Pinnacle Development Corporation had been very understanding when my lawyer explained that the sale had been based on forged documents. They'd gotten their money back, I'd gotten my property back, and Michael had gotten a 5-year prison sentence for fraud. Jessica had moved into the house I'd bought for her with her parents' help. She was working as a nurse at the county hospital and slowly rebuilding her credit and her life. Emma and David spent every weekend with me at the ranch, and for the first time in years, the sound of children's laughter filled these rooms. Michael wrote me letters from prison, long, rambling things full of apologies and explanations and promises to change. I read every one of them, and then I filed them away without responding. Maybe someday I'd be ready to have a relationship with my son again. Maybe someday he'd genuinely understand what he'd done to his family. But not today. Today I was sitting on my porch, watching my grandchildren play, and feeling something I hadn't felt since Robert died. Peace. People ask me sometimes if I feel guilty about what happened to Michael, if I think I was too harsh, too unforgiving, if I should have given him another chance. Here's what I tell them. I gave Michael 18 years of chances. I gave him love, support, opportunities, and trust. I gave him my time, my energy, my money, and my faith. When he was struggling, I helped him. When he was scared, I comforted him. When he needed guidance, I provided it. And in return, he tried to steal everything I had and throw me away like I was nothing. You don't get to betray someone that completely and then ask for forgiveness because you got caught. But here's the thing that really matters. This story isn't just about Michael's betrayal. It's about what I learned about myself in the process of fighting back. I learned that being older doesn't mean being helpless. I learned that being a mother doesn't mean accepting abuse from your children. I learned that sometimes the people who claim to love you are the ones who will hurt you the worst, and that's not your fault. Most importantly, I learned that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, even when, especially when, the people you're standing up to are your own family. I spent 67 years believing that family loyalty meant accepting whatever treatment your relatives decided to dish out. I thought that being a good mother meant sacrificing everything for your children, no matter how much they took or how little they gave back. I was wrong. Real love doesn't require you to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. Real family doesn't ask you to disappear so they can be more comfortable. And real loyalty goes both ways. My son forgot that I was a person with rights and feelings and dignity. He saw me as an obstacle to his financial goals, a problem to be managed rather than a human being to be respected. But I didn't forget who I was. And when push came to shove, I reminded him exactly what kind of woman he was dealing with. So to anyone listening to this story who recognizes themselves in my situation, anyone who's being pressured, manipulated, or taken advantage of by family members who think age makes you vulnerable, let me tell you something important. You are not a burden. You are not an ATM. You are not a problem to be solved or an asset to be liquidated. You are a human being with rights and dignity and worth, and you deserve to be treated as such. And if the people in your life can't see that, then maybe it's time to find new people. Because here's what I know now that I didn't know 6 months ago. Sometimes the best thing you can do for your family is teach them that there are consequences for treating you badly. Sometimes love means holding people accountable for their actions. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give your children is showing them that you won't let anyone, not even them, walk all over you. My ranch is still here. My grandchildren still visit every weekend. Jessica and I have coffee every Tuesday morning and talk about everything except her ex-husband. And Michael? Well, Michael is learning what it feels like to lose everything you thought you could count on, just like he wanted me to learn. The difference is I didn't deserve it. He did.